All right, everybody. I am Jesse Daley, and I have an awesome guest today, Alex DaSilva, AccuWeather's lead hurricane expert. Alex, thank you so much for being here with us. And as you know, I work with the Virgin Islands Source, and just to give all of our viewers and readers, and just to acknowledge the fact that Alex has helped the Virgin Islands so much this year throughout your expertise, and you've helped me with my stories. So thank you for all of your hard work.
Yeah, no problem. It's always great to help you guys down there in the Virgin Islands. We love to hear from you guys, and we love to give you guys the best reporting that we can, and hopefully give you the best forecast possible ahead of any potential storms.
Awesome, Alex. Well, thank you. So I have a few questions for you, and I wanted to start because this video is being, we're having this interview on October 31st, so we have about a month in hurricane season left. Obviously, the main weather, one of the main weather stories right now is, of course, Hurricane Melissa. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on this storm. How does it compare to other Category 5 systems that we've seen this year, and also throughout the Atlantic Basin in history? Because you had said, I have to preface this. I reached out to you almost every week. You said every week if a system could get into the Western Caribbean or the Gulf, it could explode. And that's exactly what happened. So I just want to hear about your thoughts about this, devastating storm.
Yeah, I mean, it was truly an incredible storm in all facets. The storm made landfall here in western Jamaica as a very powerful Category 5 hurricane, and in fact, it ties the record all time for the strongest storm to ever make landfall in the Atlantic Basin. You can see these three storms here. Of course, the Labor Day 1935 hurricane is still the strongest storm to ever hit the United States, at 185 miles per hour and a pressure of 892 millibars. That hit the Florida Keys. We now have Melissa that joined that elusive list here with 185 mile per hour winds, and a 892 pressure as well, tying the Labor Day hurricane. And then you also had Dorian back in 2019, that went through the Bahamas and just kind of sat right over the Bahamas. That also had 185 mile per hour winds, and a 910 pressure. So these three storms are now tied all time for the strongest storms ever to hit land in the Atlantic Basin. Hurricane Allen holds the record for the strongest storm by wind speed. That was 190 miles per hour at its peak wind speed, but luckily it did not hit land at 190 miles per hour. And Wilma in 2005 holds the all-time record for the lowest pressure in the tropical Atlantic Basin. But again, these three are now tied for the all-time highest wind speed for a landfalling a hurricane in the Atlantic Basin.
Wow. So, and I guess, just for our viewers that may not be completely familiar with, the pressure and like millibars, can you just explain what that means? Because we're starting to see, as this storm made landfall earlier this week, and it's taking days now to see really the catastrophic damage that this created where the eye wall went across. Can you just talk to us a little
Yeah.
bit about how this, like those dynamics and what this means? Because we hear a lot, like, the pressure's going down, and I think for those of us that understand like weather, it's easy to connect that, but I think a lot of people maybe don't have know exactly like what these numbers really mean.
Yeah, sure. So like the standard atmospheric pressure is generally between about 1,014 to 1,016 millibars or so. That is like your standard pressure, not under high pressure, not under low pressure, just kind of your standard pressure. Anything really above 1,016 or so is considered higher pressure, like you're under a high pressure system. And anything lower than about 1,014 or so would be considered lower pressure. So you can see here just incredible amounts of low pressure here, under 900 millibars. It's incredibly rare to see a storm that's under 900 millibars. Milton last year went under 900 millibars last year. But I think before Milton of last year, you have to go all the way back to 2005 with Wilma that went under 900 millibars. So it does not happen very often. And the way I always like to explain pressure to people who may not have a full grasp of what this means in everyday life is just picture you're in an airplane and you're flying up, you're ascending up into the atmosphere, and your ears begin to pop. That's essentially what's happening in your ears due to a change in pressure. The pressure is changing. Or if you're driving up a mountain, for example, your ears might pop. That's because you're going up into the atmosphere, and the pressure is lower a little bit in the atmosphere. Well, what happens in a hurricane is in the eye of the hurricane, that's where the lowest pressure is located. Essentially what that hurricane is doing is it's taking the pressure that's usually way up higher in the atmosphere and essentially bringing it down to the surface. And so when you are in the eye, if you were in the eye of this hurricane here at 892 millibars, that's as if you're, over 1,000 feet up into the atmosphere, essentially on a normal day. So essentially what it's doing is it's bringing those, it's almost like you're higher up into the atmosphere and it brings those amounts down. So if you were in the eye of that storm, your ears would pop and it would feel almost, minus the wind, of course. If there was no wind, it would just kind of feel like you're driving up a hill or you're in an airplane with your ears popping, but probably to a little bit more of an extreme level. Now, in the eye of the storm, in this storm, at least, the weather is actually pretty nice. Sometimes the sun will even come out in some of these more intense hurricanes, but right around that eye, that's where you get those big time winds. And you can see, here's a satellite image of what the storm looked like when it was making landfall at its Category 5 status here in Western Jamaica. And right in the middle of that eye, if you were there, you could probably look up into the sky and it was probably clear skies above you. The sun was even coming down in these areas and the winds were basically calm. That's where your ears would really be popping. But just outside of that ring there, that's where you saw those ferocious winds of 150, 60, 70 mile per hour winds that just devastated the western portion of Jamaica. And the storm actually took a little bit of a wobble west last minute. And that's what really caused a lot of the devastation in Montego Bay. A lot of times these really intense hurricanes can wobble a little bit. And it looked like the storm was going to come in a little bit further to the east, but at the very last second, it took this wobble west, and it had major consequences for Montego Bay, as it put Montego Bay right on that outer western eye wall of the storm, right on the western side of the storm, and it led to much worse damage in Montego Bay than if the storm had stayed a little further southeast.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a really good explanation of the pressure. Thank you for sharing that. And it actually kind of leads into some of my other questions here, because you mentioned how you have to go back, that it's rare for the pressure to come down that low, and you have to go back a ways to find storms that have been that strong. This year, alone, we've had three rapidly intensifying storms. And so I guess, in your professional, thoughts and on this, is this something that we could, because of course we're in the Virgin Islands are no stranger to hurricanes. We've had Irma and Maria. There's still ongoing recovery efforts from those storms were years ago, right? So I'm wondering, Alex, if you think that what we're seeing this year could, I know it's impossible to predict the future, but in terms of the trends, right, could we be looking at like less storms, but stronger storms that do develop?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We've seen 3 Category 5 hurricanes this year, and actually this is only the second time in history that we've seen 3 or more Category 5s in a single season. 2005 actually had 4 Category 5s that year, so that was still the benchmark year in the Atlantic Basin, but this year, is now second on that list, so we've seen a lot of storms this year. We see here 13 named storms, and you can see, luckily, most did turn away from the United States, and the Virgin Islands as well. But what we did see was, we saw a lot of tropical storms, but we only saw 5 hurricanes here. You can see that 13 named storms, but only 5 hurricanes. But Three of those, or four of those, became major hurricanes, and three of those five were full-blown Cat 5 hurricanes. So the ones that we did see essentially went to the moon when it comes to intensity. So, and a lot of that is really driven here by the sea surface temperatures. If we take a look here at the sea surface temperatures, this is current as of Halloween here, October 31st, anomalies. So what this is it's departures from normal, or departures from the historical average. So everywhere in orange and yellow here on this map are water temperatures that are above average. And what I think is really interesting is look in the area where Melissa just was. You would normally expect those waters to cool significantly after a major hurricane sits over that area for the same for an extended period of time. And you know, if the storm had happened way out here, I think those waters would be much cooler. But what is different is that in this area, and we talk about this a lot, is the ocean heat content, especially in the Caribbean, basically the whole Caribbean, but especially in the central and western Caribbean. This is an area where those warm waters extend hundreds and hundreds of feet down below the surface of the ocean. And what happens is that even if a storm comes over those areas, it mixes up the water and they really don't cool that much. There's so much energy in this area that really causes those storms to explode. And you mentioned earlier how, you know, this whole season you've been asking me, you know, is anything going to happen if a storm gets into this area? And I told you, I said, you know, there's no guarantee that a storm is going to get into this area or a tropical wave, but if one does and it doesn't get choked out by the wind shear or the dry air, it's going to explode. I pretty much, it's almost a guarantee that if the wind shear decreases in this area, it's going to go. Because there's just so much heat energy in this area that all it takes is the wind shear to drop a little bit and then boom, it's off to the races. So that's essentially what we saw this year in this area here with Melissa. And what we've seen the last couple of years is a very similar story where the waters are just so warm that we've been seeing these episodes of more rapid intensification year after year after year. And in fact, over the last 20, 30 years, episodes of rapid intensification have been increasing. And I think a lot of it is due to these very warm waters. So as we move into the future here, the research shows that episodes of rapid intensification are likely to become more and more frequent. What is not fully concluded yet if the number of storms is going to be going up or not. We might have a very similar situation years from now. You know, and in my thoughts, years like 2025 might be more common going into the future where we may see, you know, an average number of storms or a little bit above average number of storms, but we don't see a lot of hurricanes. But the hurricanes we do see go all the way. You know, go all the way to major hurricane status. So, you know, we may actually see slightly less hurricanes, but the ones we do see, I think, are likely to be much stronger because essentially they find these Goldilocks zones where there's really no wind shear. There is research to support that a warming planet might actually allow for more wind shear across the Atlantic basin as a whole. So if the planet is warmer, we actually might get more wind shear, and there's actually linking now between more atmospheric stability. And we've seen that the last 2 years where essentially the atmosphere aloft, up in the atmosphere, is actually more stable and actually kind of prevents thunderstorms from growing. So that's something we're going to have to watch here over the next couple of years to see if that continues. But that really might only affect the number of storms. I don't think it's going to affect the rapid intensification, and that's driven a lot by those sea surface temperatures. So unfortunately, I think rapid intensification is something we're going to be seeing a lot more coming up into the future, and it's something that we just really need to pay very close attention to because things can change very rapidly. As you saw with Melissa, how it just went from a Cat 1 hurricane all the way up to a Cat 5 in a very short time frame.
Absolutely. And, you know, and thank you for that explanation. You know, it got me thinking too, because that's obviously like scary. You know, I live on St. Croix and we're about, I think, 50 times smaller than Jamaica, you know, so hearing that is, of course, really scary to think about a storm like that coming through. And you know, that was going to lead me to my next question. There was like a stalling event that kind of happened with Melissa for a period of time. Do you anticipate that I mean, how likely is something like that to occur based on where we are in the northeastern Caribbean? I know there's, of course, the trade winds, and I know that the Dorian stalled in the Bahamas.
Hmm.
This one stalled by Jamaica and allowed it to have that kind of actually extreme rapid intensification, right? Is that another kind of
Yes.
phrase? So I just was
Yeah.
wondering if you think that
Yeah.
it's. I know it's impossible to predict, but could that happen based on our geographic location, in your opinion?
Yeah, let me give you a good example here. The research is actually finding that with a warmer planet, we're more likely to get more stalling storms. So there is research that is backing that up, that in recent years, we've seen the average speed of tropical cyclones go down
Mm,
and I think a lot of it has to do with the jet stream. So just normally there's a jet stream that goes up over the United States, but in a warming planet, if the planet is overall more and more warm, what's going to happen is that jet stream is going to keep climbing to the north
mm,
overall. Because you have warmer air to the south. The jet stream is essentially a boundary between cooler air to the north and warmer air to the south. That's essentially what the jet stream is. Now, the jet stream doesn't come all the way down to you guys down in the Virgin Islands, but it still can have a role in steering storms as well. So what can happen is if this jet stream moves further to the north, that allows less steering overall in the tropics. And so I think that might play a role, that if we continue to see a warming planet, the jet stream might come further north. Maybe that Bermuda high that we usually see parked out here in the Atlantic, maybe that goes further north
mm.
potentially because it likes to sit over warm sea surface temperatures. So if those temperatures are warmer, maybe it'll shift more to the north. And then you get weaker trade winds, weaker steering flow down across the tropics. So there is already research that is showing that a warmer planet is starting excuse me, is starting to lead to slower moving cyclones as a whole in the tropics. So that's just something we're going to have to watch out for. But that's kind of my thoughts as to why that's occurring. And if we continue to see a warming planet, that jet stream, I think, is going to be playing a major role in that as well.
Wow. Very, I mean, interesting and scary for us here. I guess I have so many questions for you, but I know you don't have all day. Moving ahead a little bit with, again, we have about 30. Well, the official end of hurricane season is November 30th in the Atlantic Basin. So, um, can you tell us what we could potentially expect? Over the next few weeks, do you expect? I know we had some lulls back and forth this year in tropical activity. Do you expect that maybe we'll have a busy end of the season, or maybe activity after the official end of the season? What are your thoughts on all that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, I'd like to, look at the chart here. This is just climatology showing when the busy and ending parts of the season are. And for the Virgin Islands, your guys' climatology is basically like this in
Hmm.
terms of when you guys usually see storms. Usually it's, end of August through maybe the beginning of October. And that's because of the tropical waves. You guys get tropical systems because of those tropical waves that come from Africa, and then they develop. You guys usually don't get anything from the Central American gyre or from cold fronts that stall or from dips in the jet stream near the United States. Your guys' primary cyclones originate from Africa. And so typically in November, we see much less tropical waves coming from Africa, and the ones that we do see are usually more in a weakened state. So it's usually harder just climatologically
Right.
for the Eastern Caribbean, of course, to get tropical activity. But I will say we have to take a look here. Here's our climatology map in the month of November. Again, usually it's in the Western Caribbean, sometimes in the Eastern Gulf, and then off the southeast coast. Again, you have the gyre that's down here that can develop, or troughs or cold fronts that stall along the East Coast and develop and move away. So it's very difficult to get something in the Eastern Caribbean. It has happened. We think about Wrong Way Lenny, 1999. The storm originated in the Western Caribbean and moved east and impacted the U.S. Virgin Islands as a Category 4 hurricane. It's exceptionally rare for something like that to happen, but it has happened. The storm Wrong Way Lenny moved east in the middle of November and struck the U.S. Virgin Islands as a Category 4 hurricane in the middle of November. So
Wow.
anything can happen, but climatologically, it says that you guys are pretty much in the clear after November starts. Of course, we still need to watch things because of crazy examples like what happened with Wrong Way Lenny. But nevertheless, those warm sea surface temperatures can produce storms, of course, as we talked about. And going forward here over the next couple of weeks, this is generally what I'm looking at right now. This is the area to watch. We don't have anything specifically outlined yet in terms of having dates on there or having a yellow area on there quite yet, but I'm saying that this is the area that if anything in the Atlantic is going to develop here, probably through mid-November, its best shot is here. And the reason is because this is typically where you get the Central American gyre to form. It's basically a large circulation that forms down here near Central America. And then you get low pressure to form off of that. A lot of times this can be triggered by a change in the trade wind pattern, which is essentially triggered by dips in the jet stream up here in the United States. So you get a dip in the jet stream that comes down into the Gulf. That changes the trade wind patterns down here. You get spin, and then you can get development in this area here. So usually early and late in the hurricane season, you get this Central American gyre to start spinning, and then you can get development in here that usually comes into Central America or splits off and heads towards Cuba and the Bahamas. So just climatologically, that is what we typically see this time of the year. And again, Wrong Way Lenny is a great example of why we can't 100% let our guard down, even in the Eastern Caribbean, because you can still have very weird scenarios where you have a storm that could potentially move east, or maybe you get a more robust tropical wave that comes off of Africa and can develop. And again, we talked about those sea surface temperatures. That's a significant driver, but we also have La Nina. So La Nina conditions are now present in the Pacific right here. So you can see this is Hawaii up in here. So we're talking about the region south of Hawaii in the Eastern Pacific, right along the equator. And in this box here, this is the El Nino La Nina region that is typically looked at by scientists to declare what state of ENSO we're essentially in. And so when the water temperatures are cooler in this box, which they currently are, this is designated as a La Nina. If the waters are warmer in this box or more yellows and oranges, that would be an El Nino. And what does that do to the tropics? Well, we can take a look at that in just a second here. What that does to the tropics is it changes what can typically happen in the tropics. So here's a great diagram showing what would happen during a La Nina, which we're currently in right now. We're seeing La Nina conditions in the Eastern Pacific right now. So typically we see less activity in the Eastern Pacific during a La Nina, and we usually see more activity during a La Nina in the tropical Atlantic. And that's because of the wind shear. Wind shear, that's the thing that really rips those cyclones apart. We typically see less overall in the Atlantic during a La Nina year, and so we would have more development. Now last year, 2024, it was similar to this year in the fact that late in the hurricane season, we had these La Nina conditions come on. And then what did we see? We actually saw 3 named storms during the month of November, which the average, the long-term 30-year average is very close to actually 1 storm every 2 years, long-term average. If we look at, more recent years, it's about 1 storm every year or so, and a lot of that actually has to do with those water temperatures being so warm. It gives that extra boost, and so we usually see about a storm or so every November now, at least in recent history. But since the wind shear might be a little bit less than what is typical during the month of November, I think we could see 1 or 2 storms during the month of November. Last year we saw 3. Looking at the conditions, I don't think we'll see 3. But I could see 1 or 2 certainly during the month of November. It looks like there could be an MJO wave that comes across, which is essentially a pulse of thunderstorms that circles the globe around the equator, and that can sometimes jumpstart tropical activity. And it looks like that MJO wave might be coming into the Atlantic maybe in the middle of the month or the second half of the month. So there's a few variables that I'm looking at that are leading me to believe that we could see 1 or 2 named storms in the tropical Atlantic. And then again, if we kind of go back to the climatology, where they would typically develop is usually in these areas here.
Right. Wow, thank you. I mean, that's so much great information. Do you think that this La Nina phase could last a while, or what? Because you actually had also predicted that this would happen. I think back in like earlier in the summer, you were saying we could see a La Nina at least start to develop, and again, you were right about that too. So, do you think that this could last like into the off season? I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like it's going to last through the next couple months or so, but then as we, it's a long way out, but it looks like in next spring it's going to start to warm, looks like, and we might be neutral by next spring or in the winter or late winter. And then in the summertime, there's very early indications that we actually might be trending towards an El Nino, which could suppress development in the Atlantic. But again, it's very far out. It's
Right.
too early to make those calls this far out. We need to see how things trend. But there are some early indications that, next tropical season at some point, there might be a shift towards an El Nino, which could keep the number of storms down. But I really caution people, because even if we start to see trends towards an El Nino, I really want to caution people that sea surface temperatures are still a significant driver, okay, in the Atlantic. So you might hear news outlets talking about this shift towards El Nino and how it's going to kill the tropical season and how everybody's going to be okay.
Right.
But please be careful, because even though statistically we usually see less storms during an El Nino year, these water temperatures here can kind of change things a little bit. Because they're so warm, they might be able to counteract some of that increased wind shear that we might see, and we can still see a busy season. Maybe not to the extent that if we saw La Nina year, but we can still see fairly busy seasons because of this warm water. And that's something that we're going to have to watch as we move into the future with warmer sea surface temperatures, is that these might be able to counteract some of those effects of El Nino, and kind of might change the perspective of what people think. Because normally we think El Nino, okay, less than average hurricane season. And most of the time that's true. But
Right.
as we move into the future, if these waters keep warming, we might flip the script a little bit, and we might see a little bit more activity during La Nina or during El Nino years.
That's a really good point. And, I remember at the beginning of hurricane season, the National Hurricane Center, always says and stresses, and you said this too, it takes one storm. We just saw this. I mean, we got, and I have like one more question for you, but we got with Hurricane Aaron, because that wobbled, and remember I was writing to you, I was like, man, this is looking a little concerning. And actually, there were some effects that like the Northern Virgin Islands felt from this from that storm. And yeah, it's I think that, like, I guess leading into my final question, what are your key takeaways from this season? And because it can take one storm like this and almost can just be like a surprise in a lot of ways, what are what would be your message to individuals here in the islands, that because we can't really evacuate, that's the other thing, and my heart goes out to obviously everybody that has been affected by any storm, but with Melissa, you can't really leave. So what are your thoughts on the key takeaways and what people can do to just remain vigilant and prepared?
Yeah, I mean, it's very important to follow the forecast, follow the AccuWeather forecast, follow Jesse's forecast, right? Because we work together all the time during the tropical season. And if I'm seeing something, I'm going to be telling you about it right away, Jesse, because I know how vulnerable you guys are in the Eastern Caribbean, and you guys have less time. If a
Yeah.
tropical wave comes off of Africa, you have a lot fewer days than we do here in the United States mainland, because the wave doesn't have to travel as further. So that information coming from the meteorologists to you guys is so much more important, even because you guys typically will have less time to prepare for some of these storms than the mainland United States. And so, but again, if we look at the tracks this year, overall, we got pretty lucky, at least in the United States, because most of these turned around the Bermuda High. The Bermuda High was a little further to the east this year than what is typical, and that allowed most of the storms to curve out. But we still saw impacts. We were calling for 3 to 6 impacts on the United States this year. And we did see, of course, we saw Chantal, which made landfall, but we also saw Erin. We also saw Imelda, which came close enough to bring impacts. We saw rain and wind impacts in the United States from these storms, even though they were pretty far away. And we saw major coastal issues, especially from this unnamed tropical storm or tropical rainstorm that we designated early in the season, which had some subtropical characteristics, as we call it. It was not fully tropical. That's why the National Hurricane Center never named it.
Right.
But we thought that it was enough of a risk where it had some tropical characteristics that we actually drew a track for it and really tried to get the message out. And there was a lot of homes that fell into the water in the Carolinas during that time. So, just because a storm doesn't necessarily even make landfall, it can still bring significant impacts. And my message is that we just really need to follow the forecast closely, and a lull in the middle of the season does not define the season. I heard a lot of people on social media talking about how this big lull in the season is the hurricane season done. Are we, we're not going to see anything. It's a dud. And we always thought, we were always concerned about the end of the hurricane season. Jesse, we put our forecast out in March, and you got that forecast, and we told people, we said, listen, we could see a lull in the middle of the hurricane season. We talked about the Atlantic Nina, which is another big driver in the near Africa that could actually, maybe lead to a lull in the middle of the season, but then at the end of the season, things would likely pick up. Okay, we said that since the beginning of the season. We don't want people to let their guard down. And then, of course, we had Melissa, and we're still not done with the tropical season. So I think it's just really important to follow the forecast very carefully, and to never underestimate the hurricane season. They can always flip very, very quickly, especially with these water temperatures down here that we keep stressing. So we're going to be in an environment, I think, going into the future where maybe we do see more lulls in the middle of the hurricane season. It's possible. But the problem is that as soon as that wind shear drops, the waters are so warm that things can explode very quickly. So we want people to be on alert at all times during the hurricane season, and to pay attention to the forecast. And then even if you live, or even if you're kind of outside of climatology where you might get affected, we take November, for example. The Virgin Islands typically don't see tropical activity in November, but we look back to 1999 and Wrong Way Lenny. Right. It's a rare example. It's very rare to see that, but it can happen. And if that happened today, those waters down here are even warmer than when Wrong Way Lenny was going through. So if a similar atmospheric pattern happened, a storm today could be even stronger than Wrong Way Lenny because of those water temperatures. So it's just something to be aware of for the hurricane season, and it's always good to just follow the forecast.
Absolutely. Well, Alex, I know you're busy, and I just want to say again to you and to all of the AccuWeather team, Bill and the public relations team. All of you have been extremely helpful to me and to the Virgin Islands Source readers, and so I will be in touch with you throughout, I guess, the remainder of hurricane season. We will hope for everybody for the best for the rest of the season. And thanks for all that you do, and thank you for keeping the Virgin Islands informed. Because as a communicator myself, I get concerned when you say when I'm making an article and then it might be wrong about the forecast. I appreciate when forecasters and meteorologists share what they know and what they don't know. You've always done that. It's what I try to do. So I appreciate all that you've done.
Yeah, thank you. And we always try to keep people in the know. We never want to cry wolf, of course, right. But we always want to give people scenarios. Okay, we always want to give people the possibility. If I see anything, and even if it's a low chance, I always like to tell people, because we don't want people to be surprised. Even if we think there's a 10 or 20% chance of a storm exploding, we still want to tell people that, because it can still happen. We tracked this wave. October 10th, that was the first time we started outlooking this wave, Jesse. I know you remember that. We had a yellow area. Now, the yellow area was more out in the Atlantic. It was, east of the Virgin Islands. We thought maybe that tropical wave could actually organize before it got to the Virgin Islands. It never did. It was so far south that it never was able to organize. But we kept saying, okay, it doesn't look like it's going to organize now east of the Virgin Islands, but it looks like it could go in the Caribbean, and those waters are warm. And we said, Sid, if that shear decreases, it could blow up very quickly. So again, we explained those scenarios as best we could to people. There's never a guarantee in meteorology. You never are going to be 100% sure, but the best we can do is explain those scenarios and explain the risks to the public with the most lead time as possible, especially like you said, for you guys who are a little bit more vulnerable on an island where it's a little bit harder to evacuate. That can cause a problem. Now, obviously, you guys are a little more accustomed to storms, so you guys are, the infrastructure, I'm sure, is at least in some areas is probably built at least a little bit for hurricanes, right? Would that be correct?
And yeah, yes, more so since Irma and Maria.
Okay. Yeah,
So
and yeah, I mean, there's areas here that are, of course, more vulnerable, but like Bermuda, for example. I mean, we always say Bermuda is like the fortress of the Atlantic.
fortress.
It's like a fortress. But obviously, areas down in the Caribbean, you know, there are some. I'm sure there's some building codes down there that some, at least with newer structures, right?
Yes. Right.
Okay.
And I think what you said for that main message, just being as prepared as possible and watching the forecast, because obviously
Yeah.
it can change. And I know that that you'll let us know if you see
Okay.
anything coming this way. And yeah, I appreciate it. My session here is going to be ending soon, so I want to make sure to tell everyone, follow AccuWeather and Alex DaSilva, AccuWeather's lead hurricane expert. We appreciate everything, Alex, and I will talk to you throughout hurricane season. Come on down to the Virgin Islands. I'm sure everyone would love to have you down here. It's especially in the out of hurricane season. The weather is pretty, as you know, it's like always perfect.
I've actually been down to St. Thomas on
Okay.
a cruise one time, and I thought it was absolutely beautiful down there. Never went to the island where you're at, but St. Thomas, I really enjoyed. I know I was only there, for a day or whatever with the cruise ship, but I really enjoyed the island. I thought it was absolutely beautiful, and the people were so friendly down there. I loved it.
Awesome. Well, yeah, the Virgin Islands are amazing. People are amazing. Yeah, visit St. Croix. I love Little St. Croix too. So visit down here. And everybody, thank you for watching this interview. Thanks again, Alex, and to the AccuWeather team for everything you've done throughout this season.
Thank you.